Welcome to another episode of Stolen Voices, the fight against human trafficking in First Nation communities. I'm your host, Nicole Robertson. This podcast exists because our people deserve to hear the truth about how human trafficking impacts First Nation communities, and because we have leaders, survivors, advocates, and frontline workers who refuse to let silence continue enabling violence. On this episode of Stolen Voices, we're honored to welcome a trailblazer and icon whose work spans storytelling, filmmaking, advocacy, and national leadership in the media arts and political landscape. Tina Keeper is a proud member of Norway House Cree Nation in Treaty Number 5 territory, with family ties to Muskrat Dam First Nation in Treaty Number 9. She is an award-winning actor, producer, and former member of parliament. She's also a long-standing advocate for Indigenous rights and representation. Many know Tina Keeper for her groundbreaking role as RCMP officer Michelle Kennedy on the CBC series North of 60. She then became the first Indigenous woman to win a Gemini Award for a leading role on a Canadian television series. Beyond acting, Tina is the president of Kistigan Pictures, where she works to create opportunities for Indigenous storytellers across film and television. Her work continues to amplify Indigenous voices and create space for authentic representation. She has also served as an honorary witness for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and contributed to national conversations on Indigenous rights. Tina has been recognized with numerous awards, including the Order of Canada. We're grateful to have her join us today. Hi, Tina Key, and welcome, Tina, to the Stolen Voices podcast.
Oh, hello, Nicole. It's such an honor to be here. And congratulations on this podcast. I know that it's not just simply a podcast, but it's an opportunity to um, work with the public and work with families. And so congratulations on that work that you are doing in this podcast.
Oh, thank you so much. And I really appreciate your time and, all the work that you're doing. And we are just so glad that you're here on Stolen Voices with us today. And your career, it spanned decades with storytelling, advocacy work, political leadership. How has your lived experiences, like as an Indigenous woman, First Nation woman, shaped your view on human trafficking and violence against Indigenous women and girls?
Oh, that is such a great question. I was actually just talking about this with my one of my colleagues yesterday who is Indigenous as well at work. And I was saying that lived in northern Manitoba on First Nation that my father was working at when I was born, and then up until the age of 5. And we moved from the reserve to the city because my mother didn't want her children to be taken to residential school. And I was the oldest girl. So she said, it didn't hit me until you're the one that really sparked this in me because of my own experience. And so we moved to the city, and I, grew up, started grade 1. I didn't go to kindergarten. Um, and I can recall being a teenager, like in junior high, thinking that I was just so safe because my family was so safe. I come from a family on both sides of my parents. Their families didn't drink alcohol. So because they lived the old way, they're from the north on both sides. They're from, my parents were raised on the land. They lived traditionally. So even when I was a child, federal regulations still hadn't imposed at the community level to the degree where people were still allowed to build their own housing, and people lived old style, much the way they had, for all time, I guess. And you know, they, so that there was no, in my mother's community, there was no sustained contact with outsiders. And my father's community was an old fur post and fur trade post. And so they had had, like a couple hundred years of sustained community with the fur trade. However, their lives as Cree people hadn't been um, like like as a group affected. So my grandfather was raised on wasn't raised in town. He was raised on their family's trap line, and they lived in an area which was their traditional territory. So I think all of this is really important in terms of my story, in that I was raised with a different uh, an old style kind of perspective where, um, that women were seen as integral to the lives of the family, and so were children. And, we hear these sayings such as, you know, that God or Creator blesses us with children, they're blessings from, above. And that is literally how, we were treated, in the way that I think it was traditional, that we were very much seen as, important to the family. And my father wasn't violent, my grandfathers weren't violent, there was no violence in the home. So I had this outlook on life. As a young teenager, I didn't yet have the sense that there was all of these impacts that were yet to come. In the north in particular, I'm speaking about, because that's my experience. But where, at the time when I was young, you could still send, young people, if you were acting up in the city, your parents would say, "We're going to send you home, to the reserve," and because that's where they knew it would be safe, and people would be watching over you, and you would be sort of straightened out. And, because you have people still lived, hunting and fishing and traditionally. And so there was also work to do, that you had to participate in. And I think that it wasn't until I started getting a bit older that I started to recognize, racism, I would say, as the first indicator to me, um, that was really at the time excluded us from, having um, the opportunities in Canada that, the average Canadian young person might have, which would be to, get a job at Safeway after work, or get a job at the bank. That might be what you aspire to. Like, sort of all of these sort of regular things, I started to see as, started to understand that we were being excluded from Canada's, in large part, from their economy. And I think that, for myself personally, because I'd had such a strong upbringing, I had already thought that, long before because I'm a baby boomer. Like, baby boomers didn't even have to go to university. They just went straight into government jobs, but I did take the university stream. I did think I was going to go to university. And I think that, it was starting to, become clear at a certain point in my life that there were impacts that were affecting um, a lot of youth. And had started volunteering with my mother was a community worker in the city of Winnipeg, and I used to volunteer and run after school programs, for what they called children at risk and youth at risk. And I think that was sort of when I started to understand the idea that, you know, that there were kids that were being affected by CFS, that there was children that were being raised in non-Indigenous homes that were adopted into those homes. So I would say, it was by the time I was 20, I was becoming aware of all of that, and that there was also a danger and in my mind, it was to all young women that there was a danger. You had to be careful around men, because they could be dangerous. And because I just hadn't seen anything like that, I really had a hard time imagining it until um, it happened to one of my best friends at the I was 23 years old, and um and when she went missing and then murdered, her life was portrayed in the newspapers as a missing and murdered prostitute. And I was devastated by that. And that was really the point at which I understood that mainstream Canada, you know, looked at us in a way that um, was almost the antithesis to how I understood us as Indigenous people. That I thought we were, I just felt so blessed to be an Indigenous person from a family, that was really strong and didn't engage in violence, and I was seen as integral. And so to see that sort of dismissiveness, the disdain, I think, was something that I found so shocking. And so that was a turning point for me, for sure.
That is definitely, you know, a story which is sadly between First Nation women, girls, Indigenous, straight across, that we all are connected somehow to somebody that either went murdered or missing. And in that time that you're speaking about, that's really sad how things get portrayed in media. So in the storytelling that you do, and some of the work that you have really have done an absolute brilliant job of bringing to light some of these stories. How do you think that sort of has played a role in turning that narrative on its back, and exposing MMIWG and 2S, plus also, human trafficking? How do you think that's changed since that time to where we're at today?
I would say that that period, now I'm talking in the 80s when this happened. And then subsequently, I lived through um, an experience in which I believe it was the same person because the MO was the same as what happened to my friend. And so my personal experience changed my life. And I suffered, um, PTSD. Really started to affect me, I would say, about a year after that happened, and has like remained in my life since. So I think that what became clear to me when it happened to me was that we're all at risk. I knew that we were all at risk, um, not because of not because you might be living a life of risk, or a high, like what they refer to as a high risk lifestyle, or come from a high risk group of people, but by virtue of just being an Indigenous woman, which is, really went back to the story with Helen Betty Osborne, and in the review, the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry, which I was very fortunate to be living in an area where this kind of advocacy was happening. And in fact, this the review of Helen Betty's death and the voice of what characterized her death was really important to me personally, because it did validate this thought that it was, as Indigenous women, we were targeted. And we were targeted, as I understand, because, uh, going back to what I started to see as a young person, when I wanted an after school job, or when I was starting to understand that, we were excluded from the Canadian economy, or that, putting those things together, that was, oh, so this is, and then the media reports around my friend, and just understanding this is how Canada sees us. What was highlighted in the report on Helen Betty's death. And, Helen Betty was also from Norrie House, and I knew her sister. She was a really good friend of mine at the time. I knew her mom and her brother. And so, and my cousin has been, one of the advocates that have, really made her story an international story. So that was really important for me. So this work that you're doing, where you are raising awareness and saying these things to the public and to Indigenous people out there, like Indigenous women and young men, and um, is so important, because the more information we have, that we understand, um, what is happening, what is the dynamic in Canada, there is ways, I think, for us to then feel that we can participate in advocacy ourselves. We can also understand that what we're thinking is true. And, and that helps, because you start to feel like, maybe I'm making this up, and maybe I'm wrong, and you really need the assistance. Like, I would say that, that when I sought assistance after my attack, I saw a non-Indigenous, um, and they were actually, there for sexual assault crises. That person said to me, well, you're not wrong about, like, it's like the estimate is that 7 out of 10 men would actually rape a woman, and if they could get rid of it, get away with it or something. She said something like that. It was just really a horrifying, um, you know, uh,
That's horrible.
it was a horrifying statistic. But it also did tell me, going back to Helen Betty's death, which is, who are these men that are doing these things? And I often have thought about, in the context of, anti-human trafficking work, and, um, our work as on the inquiry in the MMIW space, um, is that, who are we talking about? Like, who are the people, And I think that that is kind of something that has to definitely be next level. Like, it needs to be understood that there are high levels of risk for the average young woman in Canada. When you look at the National Hockey League and the fact that they had a defense fund, like, knowing that their players were going to engage in sexual assault, and that they had a fund to pay off the victims, that is at the highest level of, like, the average Canadian, right? Like, it's, this is what all young Canadians aspire to, and their parents want their kids to be in the NHL. And here's a body that is protecting these offenders. And so what it says to me is that this is very common, that it is, as much as we like to think of ourselves as friendly people in Canada, that we have this underlying misogyny and, you know, this this rage against women almost, and or an utter contempt for women, that they are there to be used as men, at a man's discretion. And that goes for, the 2S community, of course, and the you know, the trans community, and anybody who is queer or um, asexual or intersectional. Like, it's like the this dynamic is very common, and I think that that is something that really needs to be understood in Canada. I think that also, that where people were safe um, before are now, is very different in terms of the modern culture for young people, which is, very much has to do very much with alcohol and drugs. And, whereas when I was a young person, if somebody drank every weekend, that was seen as like a really heavy drinker. Like, it was so uncommon. Whereas now, that's sort of the norm in Canada. And I know, like, the addictions center, the Canadian Research Center for Addictions, they talk about, the level of binge drinking and alcoholism has increased something like 20-fold in the last, 30 years. So, I think that's a really big contributing factor too. So I'm going to try and go back to what you were asking me, which is around my work and how that fed into my work. So I think, as I said, having gone through what I did, and then and with my friends, and then starting to know that um, this work, especially in Manitoba, when they did the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry, that was groundbreaking. That was just really, seminal work in terms of validating what was happening to Indigenous women and Indigenous men as well. In the case of late J.J. Harper, who was targeted by police, um, but that, that we were being targeted in Canada. And so when I uh, first got involved in terms of bringing the issue to into the arts was when Tantu Cardinal had become involved in the project called the Vagina Monologues with the author, and they had been doing the show yearly in different countries, in different, like, it I had, I think, debuted on Broadway or something, and then it had, just had so much acclaim. This project by Eve Ensler, which was based on her interviewing, hundreds of women. And it went on to become a project that was understanding sexual violence against women. And she then started to work with communities of women. And all the proceeds on this special day or a special week of the year, where she would allow people to use the vagina monologues without paying, a license fee for that, that they could do that in their community and raise money for a local women's shelter. So that became a movement, and Tantu did. a performance in Rapid City, South Dakota, with Eve Ensler and with Jane Fonda. And and Tantu had premiered a new monologue that was written for the show, the yearly show. And that was on the experience of a Lakota woman. And so that became um, part of the yearly show that was licensed. So we did the following year. Tantu asked me to produce a show for in Canada, and it just was coinciding with the release of a report in Canada with which was a commission by the Native Women's Association of Canada and the Amnesty International. Um, and it was an international report which was called Stolen Sisters, and that would have been in 2004. And to launch the report, they had a gathering of the families that participated in the report, and the launch was being held in Ottawa. And we then did the first staged performance of the vagina monologues as a post dinner event for the families. And it was, um, and we actually involved, and this is part of the experience of the intent of the project is to also work with local women. And so we had the executive director of the women's shelter, and we had the writer of the report. The writer researcher was Bev Jacobs, who was at that time the president of the, or was maybe, might have even been prior to her becoming president, but she did become the president of the Native Women's Association of Canada. And so we had this intersection of like actors and non-actors, and it was for the family members, and we had health supports there and elders there, and it was a really profound experience. And the family members um, really appreciated it because they felt that it gave them a chance to cry, to laugh, to hear their families, their loved ones experience expressed openly and publicly. So that was a really profound experience. And we started, we very much understood what Eve was talking about in terms of being able to, utilize the arts, the stage as a voice for family members and or survivors. And so we did the show for 2 more years, and then I think I got elected. And while I was elected as a member of parliament in January of 2006, and I served until October of 2008. And I had 35 First Nations in my riding, and we were able to do one show of the, no, we did two shows of the vagina monologues in the riding over the 2.5 years that I was there. And so we continued that on. And again, it was by that time, as an MP, so I'm kind of rolling into, these years now. I'm an elected official. The reason I ran, um, had to do with these urgent issues, which were, MMIWG, 2S plus, um, were, now being understood to be an alarming crisis in Canada. And, the worst was yet to come, sadly, but again, we started to, really advocate and um, and I would say that, even in terms of my experience on the Hill, that it was really astounding to see how removed, that not only the politicians were, but the researchers, the people that work in the bureaucrats were removed from the experience of Indigenous people in Canada. So, given that I was in a situation which I really hadn't anticipated for myself because I didn't think I would win that election. Um, However, um, what I understood, in arriving there was that this was a place from which change could possibly be made. And I thought, I need to find my allies. And I very quickly came to understand that, some people who I thought would be, you know, strong allies because, they were known. I knew them in Manitoba as strong leaders, political leaders, and um, and they were very, just really, again, it was not within their wheelhouse to make space to understand where they were involved in, what I would call white supremacy mindset, and that they were practitioners of that, and that they were also um, very exclusive, and and me and my writing and what I represented, or what was on my agenda for my work was not of interest to them. And that was really discouraging because, this was, many of these are people that were in, definitely faces of what we would call like champions of human rights, and, or, leaders, really strong um, leaders that had the values of, really the charter, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so I think that I really started to see that there were really you know, two distinct separate um, parts of our country. And even more so, I'm sure, than, just my experience. I'm sure that there are other people that were there to represent their population, who might be, a minority in Canada, and or a population that is, under attack, and they might have felt that way too if they were representing those people. So it was a really, it was challenging in that sense, and also worked really closely with the Indigenous organizations back home in Manitoba to just continue to raise awareness, and to raise, opportunities in the House, like a motion or a private member's bill around Jordan's Principle, or around the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and continued to work within my caucus around, raising awareness that there wasn't universal access to healthcare in this country. We were also there when the Indian residential schools compensation agreement was, um, passed. And it wasn't actually a piece of legislation, but it was tabled in the House. And I was asked to speak to the package in on behalf of my party. We were the official opposition, and I had a really hard time accepting that. And I, was very fortunate to have my parents alive at the time. And I talked to them both, and I told them I didn't think I could speak to the agreement without falling apart or, crying. I said, because, this, that, that policy by the government to really destroy, um, you know, Indian people, to destroy our families and our communities, our livelihoods, all of that, everything that my parents had lived through, and I had also lived through, like the flooding of our lands. And so everything to destroy us, was wrapped up in that. And and then it was so crystal clear to me too how that just goes along with hand in hand with the MIWG, 2S plus. Like it's all about this old policy that said it's okay to destroy them. And that was just, just so overwhelming at the time. And I said to my parents, I don't think I can do this. And they said, my girl, what they've done to us, they have done to themselves. That's their way. That's not our way. Remember that. That's not our way. And that just gave me so much peace. And they said, my parents, my parents would say this to me, you need to pray for them, because it's really pitiful. They're really pitiful people. Like, and it was just, so I said, well, I don't think I can do that part of it. Like maybe you can do that part of it. I don't feel that strong right now. Um, and that again was that became a reference point for me. Like this is not our way. These things that are happened to us. So really going back to what is our way? And that way of our people was, resilience, discipline, love was at the center of everything, you know, um, being taught properly, being taught how to do things. So, being part of family, being like um, a part of a spiritual family of the cosmos, of the land, of the water. Like, I just felt so, like, so proud of who we were. And I was, able to do that. Like, I was able to walk in there and I just felt so proud of who we are and our way. And I was able to, speak to um, that agreement and speak to the strength of the survivors and their resilience, courage to do that work, to bring that agreement forward, because it wouldn't have happened except for the survivors. So all of the work that we see that is being championed, like the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry, the Stolen Sisters report, all of these things, these were our people. We're right that are righting the wrongs. And I think that that's not to say that there is like so much collateral damage. It's, but in the midst of all of that, we need to keep going, with this knowledge that the ancestors are with us, that this is not our way, that way's not our way, and that we have our own ways, and that propels us. There's like, I know it sounds a little, okay, I'm just going to say it anyways, but that there's a natural energy in that, and that it propels things. It propels the change. The shift happens really fast, and in that, I could even see that where when I ran and was elected in 2006, I was literally the second First Nations woman to be ever in the House, um, the federal House of Commons. That was in 2006. And Gary Morasti and I, who were elected at the same time, were literally like the fifth and sixth First Nations people to be elected into the House of Commons. And there was over 308 people when we were elected. Now there's like something like 340 or 50 seats. So, and that was the 41st Parliament. So, but since that time, since 2005 or six, since the election in 2008, to now, like now we have, two nations women that are sitting in the cabinet. So, again, like that, what happens is, as we are moving forward towards justice and towards reparation and towards, um, you know, a safe world for our people in this country and a just country. I think that, there's so much work that we need to continue to do, but there is also the work that Canadians need to do. And that part of reconciliation, I think, needs to be around creating a compassionate society and a society that understands the difference between yes and no, and a society that understands that there are third world living conditions in this country. They have turned a blind eye and they have turned away, and they have a lot of work to do in reconciliation. This work matters because it changes people's lives. Like, it's how, even as something as simple as like when I was young and I was in university and I came to realize how much I loved acting. I took it as like an elective in first year, and I had also worked in theater at the Indian Métis Friendship Center in Winnipeg, and I had been the visual artist, so I did the sets and the costumes. But I really fell in love with acting when I was in university, and it was because there was a woman named Tantu Cardinal that I didn't know. I didn't think I'd ever meet. But she was out there and she was acting. And so I thought, well, if Tantu Cardinal can do it, maybe I can do it. Like, that's really why, I actually did a double major in university in theater. Like, it was literally due to that, like just her being out there doing that work. And so that is how I've sort of, continued to do my work, is that the work that we do is seen and it's important. It's like it might change somebody's mind. It might make a difference in somebody's life. And so, um, I think that the work that I did in Parliament, I loved it. I loved the opportunity to be there because there's so much work to be done on behalf of First Nations people there. There's so much research that has to be done. Um, like just there's an to me, there is like a never ending amount of research towards whether they are class action suits or whether there are appropriate legislation that needs to be done. I think we're just at the starting point of like significant shift for Indigenous people in Canada. And um and so just moving on from that, again, it was like once I, when I lost my seat, I was really okay with it because I really didn't anticipate winning. And that is not to say that I really did love the work. I really, really was honored by that work. I got to meet people from all over the riding, and it was so significant to me to, meet with families that were living in third world conditions, that invited me into their home, that, were, they really still hoped that their world could be changed. Or meeting like elders from Saisi Dene who had lived, had been forcibly relocated to Churchill and lived on the fringes of that society. I mean, to the degree of the garbage dump. And and then those elders praying with me and believing that, we could make change. Like, so it was really the people in the riding that had lost the most that gave me the most courage and the most um, energy, towards working on their behalf. And I think that that continued to, has always continued to fuel me. And I had then an opportunity to create a um, film production company. At the same time, I was being offered a large role in some work that I knew was going to be very, very important in the country. And um, and I had to make a decision between these two offers. And what was at the middle of that was my own children. And I've always really believed that, um, that my children are ceremony, that being a mother is ceremony. I really believe that. And I have really felt that, that the way of our old people was that, we were all together, we were integral, family was integral. And I always felt that my work needed to keep my children safe. And so that's why I left television in the first place. After North of 60, I turned down a new series to stay home with my children, and I wanted to raise them in Manitoba. And I wanted them to know their grandparents and know their own people. And um, and then when I lost the election, I was really at peace with it because I had been away from my kids for 3 years. And my mom used to pray with me. That really helped me get through those 3 years because I felt enormous grief and guilt. But I really did know that I needed to be with my children to help them because the gap was too big, from me being away. And so when I had these two offers for this, for this work, this one, which again would have had a lot of impact on for Indigenous people and working with some really, really amazing leaders, or this other job, which was to start this new company, which I was had this dream of where I was cultivating this little garden of these flowers. And my cousin, I had been having dinner with my cousin, telling him about this. And I said, and he said, "Oh, kissed again, like a garden." And I said, "To garden?" I said, "Yeah." And then he goes, "Well, honey, you need to stay in your garden." And I said, I need to stay in my garden. And so I decided to go with, the film company, Just Again Pictures. So that's where the name comes from. And I, I was have deeply regretted that I had to turn down the other offer. And, but, the work that I've been able to do through Kissed Again Pictures has included, a TV series that was actually a project created by APTN to develop capacity for writers, directors, producers. And that was where me and actually a producer that now works with Kissed Again Pictures, she and I worked together, and we had co-produced a TV show called Cashing In for APTN. And our writers and directors that came up through that project and were mentored by Norma Bailey, who was our showrunner. And she's a woman in Canada who's from Manitoba, and she's just a super strong ally of Indigenous people. We were able to we had Tracy Deer, who went on to make Mohawk Girls and her film Beans, and then Adam Garnet Jones, who's now with APTN, and writers that have been able to go on and do their own series. And and actor talent, of course, that and crew talent that has been able to stay in the industry. So that's always been our mandate with Kistigan, was to create opportunities for Indigenous people. At the same time, we were able to curate the work that we wanted to work with. I was able to. I didn't want to do it like just to do whatever. I wanted to have a clear mandate to pick projects that I felt were important to send out to the world. And so, despite the scandal on Three Black Spruce with Joseph Boyden, um, we had optioned the book. And what I did was I had worked with the woman who created North of 60, Barbara Samuels, who had become a very dear friend. Um, and we worked together to, she wrote the script, but I worked with her closely. And I really wanted to create that project because at the center of it was a story about MMIW and about, again, about, women who well, a community that's in crisis because of IRS, the Indian residential school system, and that their strength is being drained, that their lives have changed, and they're still in flux. That they're they're not sure how to handle the changes, of drugs coming into the community and the mother and the uncle were both survivors, and so what that meant for them in terms of not always having the clarity to um, live their lives the way they felt they should have. And so it really was an homage to my mother, because that was set in Treaty 9 territory. And my mom's from that, Treaty 9 territory. And the impacts of my mother's residential school experience for her and her siblings was really extreme. And yet, there was a lot of love in the family. And I felt that that was really portrayed in that film. And I was able to produce that. And, we were able to bring you on, Nicole, as a, to, train as a publicist. And I just felt that, again, all the knowledge keepers and cultural knowledge keepers, the language experts that worked with us on that project, really guided us through every step of that project. Um, and then, I've gone on to do, I worked with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and with the Royal Winnipeg Ballet to create a new work called Going Home Star, in which we worked with the TRC commissioners and the survivors of the TRC to create that project. And it was a work of reconciliation in that it was going to be the company that was going to execute the ballet, and but it would be created with the with Indigenous talent, including Steve Wood of Northern Cree Singers and Tanya Tagak, the internationally renowned um, uh, Inuit performer. And then, yeah, so that's sort of how my career has moved, I guess, and continues on. We are just entering our fifth season of Acting Good, which is the first time a comedy, First Nations, comedy show has been on a mainstream network in Canada, and has also been the number one show for the first 4 years of its run. And so that's been successful. And I think it speaks to what Canadians do want to see Indigenous content. I know that Little Bird, they had started filming around the same time we started filming, and it's a totally different, project. It was about the 60s scoop, but that also like just won, um, I think it was the most awards at the Canadian CSAs. Um, they broke the record. They also were very successful in terms of their limited series run. And so again, that speaks to me about Canadians do want to know. I think the younger generation of Canadians are much more open, much like do want to understand and do want to know Indigenous people. And I feel that there is, although it may feel like, there, and I even said it earlier, there's much reconciliation to do on their part. Like, I think that, in terms of where they need to make an effort to invest in their own learning and for schools to understand their dynamics of, what is it truly to be an ally? What is it truly to understand white supremacy and white fragility? And but they, on the other hand, because of the TRC, I think you're seeing a different generation of Canadians too that just really do have open hearts. And I think we can continue to, work with those people, our allies, in all the systems, like policing systems. I know that you are working on an anti-human trafficking project as well. And of course, that's, something that we've been working on too in Manitoba. I volunteer with the MMIWG 2S Plus campaign here. And, we've just had the Red Dress Alert um, project, which had over 35 sessions all over Manitoba with Indigenous families and communities about the Red Dress Alert. And they are hoping to implement that going forward. We also had within that work a campaign because the Grey Cup was held here last fall, an anti-human trafficking campaign. And again, like trying to dispel the myths of what that is and really giving it people, the public, information about what, and the families about, how young women become at risk um, or two-spirited people, trans people become at risk when there are these huge gatherings in cities. And so I think that, again, moving forward, there's just so much continued work for advocacy, continued work for us in terms of, voicing our stuff through podcasts and through the arts and through the television projects and movies and performance. And I think that, again, there needs to be really, um, I think it would be amazing if Canada would commit to doing national TRC gatherings in an ongoing manner. I think that's really what this country needs. I think that there does need to be a strategic commitment by Canada to reconciliation. And in that, in terms of Bill C-5, that commitment to reconciliation needs to have a component within the bill that um, does acknowledge MMIWG 2S plus and the dangers um, of the kind of large infrastructure work that they're talking about and that relationship to MMIWG 2S plus.
Thank you so much. For those that don't know what is the red dress alert, I know Manitoba has been really, at the forefront of a lot of work that's been done with, this work in MMIW 2S plus and the work that you're doing. For those that don't know what is the red dress alert, and perhaps it could become even national in nature. I know that, in the prairies, it's very much needed and right across this country. So maybe we could just touch upon that.
So just to let you know, the money that came, I guess, from the National Inquiry to each region has, each province has been able to, I guess, allot that money. Anyways, in Manitoba, we have a project called Kiganawin Nanik. And the project was entrusted with leading the development and implementation of a pilot red dress alert system in Manitoba. And the proposed alert system will quickly mobilize police and other agencies, Indigenous governments and organizations, service providers, and the general public in the critical hours and days after a community or family member is reported missing. So there is a report that has been done, and that report is on the website for the Giganaway project. And I can just give you the address, which is www.giganawe.ca. And if you go to that website, there is the report on the Red Dress Alert and what they heard in all of their engagement through this past year.
I'm so honored to have, been a part of today's podcast with you and to understand a bit more even about your life. And I'm just always blown away listening to you and the wisdom, the knowledge, and even the ancient ones, I say, that help speak, you know, uh,
Mm-hmm.
through you. It's super important that we understand, the historical, accuracies to this present day, and looking at that, and how we're moving forward. What do you what do you hope when it comes to, any Indigenous-led solutions? I know we talked about the red dress alert. What gives you hope um, for the future in this area of healing and prevention?
Well, I have to say that I've got a story I've got to tell you, but I'm going to tell you something else first. So, first off, I would say that some of the work that's being done in the schools in Manitoba, for sure, in Winnipeg School Division number one, is extraordinary. So that because I've grandchildren that go to school here, and my youngest grandson is 6 years old, and he's in a Cree immersion program. And it was so cute because one day we were walking into this restaurant and it had two big horses out front, like statues. And he was telling me the names of different animals in Cree as we were approaching the restaurant. And then, he's so cute, like he's 6, right? And then I said, son, I was like, do you know what? I always call him son. Do you know what they call? Do you know how to say horse in Cree? And he says, no, I don't. I said, do you know how to say dog in Cree? He goes, yeah, a Tim. I said, horse is a big dog, Mr. Tim. Oh, that is funny, Coco. He says, that's funny. It was so cute. And it just filled my heart. Like I felt like, in that Grinch movie, TV show. Like it was like my heart was just so full. And then of course my granddaughter, she goes to a school again. She's in junior high school, and um, she's just doing so well. And the schools are so open to the families and to our history and to family members being part of their learning experience. And she feels like she's got every option, open in the world. And she sees the work that Kokum does, and she'll come and be on set and be in the background performer, or we visit other people's sets. So it's just it's such a different. I think it's such a wonderful. It's wonderful to see your grandchildren grow up and not to feel excluded, and that they understand that their culture is part of Canada, and that the work that their great grandparents did, their Chabans did, was that it changed this country, and they're so proud of that. But then on the other hand, last night, I was just on my way home from the store, and I stopped at a stop sign, and this young woman comes up to my window, and and she was a young Indigenous woman, and I said, she was young, like I thought she was about 15, and she turns out she was 13. And she was in distress, and I said, what do you need? And she said, can you drive me home? And I said, yeah, where's your home? And so she got in the car, and then I drove her home. And she was in CFS. She lived in a foster home. She was 13 years old. She'd only been in this home for 2 months now. Um, and she started crying in the car. She said, I really miss my dad. He passed away. I miss my mom, but I haven't seen her for a long time. And I thought, there's nowhere even to phone, like for that girl to phone or for me to phone, except for a CFS agency, like, a CFS related, 24 hours place. And I thought we really need a safe line that is literally operating 24/7, that can just have like volunteers or whatever go on, help these girls be safe and be in a safe space and find safe space for them. It was, again, it was just so random, and it happened the night before this podcast. And the only thing I said to her, can I phone your mom and your foster mom? She said, I don't know her number and I don't have a phone. So, I talked to the mom when I got there, and the mom had just come back from checking around where the girl goes to school. But, it's like, where do I even report that? Or, you know, like there is, again, still so much work to do. And I think that because we are at risk, that girl could have easily been picked up by anybody. She's just lived her whole life in foster care. I wish there was a place that we could phone that was safe. It was really shocking and disheartening, and you know.
You were there, creator's timing, and you're right. There needs to be much more supports, much more awareness around where to go. And, there is a 24-hour, 7 days a week anti-human trafficking line, but that's, very specific. We need to have much more in place. With the discussion that I had with a guest, Josie Nepanak, who is the current CEO of the Native Women's Association of Canada. It's
Mm-hmm.
practically doubled since COVID, in terms of the number
Um,
of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and looking at, how things have just completely have gone off into a different area. And it's much more of a scarier time that we live in, given the political realms that
mm-hmm.
have happened and are occurring, specifically, even at looking at this province of Alberta. It's definitely much more of a scarier times that we live in, and
Mm-hmm.
with technology. And I don't want to, obviously, for our listeners, be that person to say there's no hope. There is hope. I always believe that, and I wouldn't be doing this if there wasn't. But creating new ways and pathways of trying to create a safer place for our up and coming generations of First Nation women, young women, girls, Two Spirit plus, and ways of trying to create a safer world. What is yours in closing?
In closing, I would like to say that I'm proud of the family members that had the courage to bring the story of their loved ones to the forefront of the nation, and to continue to raise the voices of the lives lost. And it is uh, an ongoing crisis that I don't think our federal government can ignore. And I also do believe that in the context of truth and reconciliation, that there is much work to be done in Canada on behalf of the families of the MMIWG and the survivors. And that, you know, my hope is that one day this is not an issue, that, that young women feel safe in this country. That's how it should be. That young people, whether they're two-spirited, trans, queer, you know, all young people feel safe in this country. That's how it should be.
I agree. And I think that just by us having this discussion and putting some good, not just energy, but action, and you've always been about that. And I'm so proud to call you a friend, and also, and in the work that you're continuing to do. Just I'm just so inspired, and beyond that, it's spiritual work, it's heavy work, but at the same time, that's what our ancestors have equipped us with. We'll continue to have these discussions, and I'm so incredibly grateful, Tina. Hi,
Mm.
Kinanaskamatin, for your
Ah,
beautiful spirit, and I'm so honored.
can I ask my then? I really, really thankful that you're doing this work, Nicole. I
Mm,
have to say.
like I said. Tina Key, for sharing your knowledge, your experiences, and your voice with us today, my friend Tina Keeper. To our listeners, thank you for joining us for this episode of Stolen Voices, the fight against human trafficking in First Nation communities. If this conversation brought up strong emotions or memories, please take care of yourself. Reach out to a trusted support person, community resource, or a crisis line. This podcast exists because our stories matter, our people matter, and every single stolen voice deserves to be heard, honored, and protected. If you or someone you know needs help, please call the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline at 1-833 900 1010. It's available 24/7, confidential, and judgment free. You can always reach out to us by email at stolenvoicesthepodcast@gmail.com. Please subscribe to the podcast, share it with your community, and follow G4 Justice for updates. Until next time, stay safe and stay informed. Hi, Ginanaskamatin, which means in Cree, thank you, I am very grateful.